those of us who are watching us on Zoom, welcome. We're really, really excited to be here today at Boulder Lake Environmental Learning Center. And I am going to pass the baton. I'm Sherry Rovig, president of the Head of the Lake chapter of Master Naturalists. And we are sponsoring this event along with Boulder Lake Environmental Learning Center. Really great at giving us the opportunity. So right now, first I want to introduce Robin Tchi, who's going to introduce our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming on such a lovely day. I'm really looking forward to Tim's talk. Tim's was the former director of Grand Portage National Monument, superintendent, not director, for at least 20 years. And he also has a long history, which I think he'll talk about. You were also superintendent at a couple of other places.
I had other Park Service roles in
Yeah.
other places. Yeah.
Many years of experience, but I know Tim actually through soccer, but and when I saw this article in the Duluth News Tribune about Isle Royale and inviting the Anishinaabe of the Grand Portage Nation back into a role of leadership with Isle Royale, and Tim was in there. It was just a really wonderful article, and I was thinking about the books I've read that he's written about the Native people in Minnesota and sort of the natural history of Minnesota and how all of those things relate to us as naturalists. I thought, what a great person it would, to come and speak to our group. And it's nice that some people are able to connect through Zoom too. There's a lot of interest in the work that you've done for a lot of people. And so I just want to welcome Tim Cochran. Thank you so much for coming down from Grand Portage.
Yeah.
One thing, excuse me, Brian, do we need to have people to turn off their Wi-Fi on their phone?
Yes, if you do have yes, if it's automatically connected to UMD.
Oh,
Here. When was it? When did we update it? All right.
While we're dealing with technical issues, which will resolve shortly, just want to let people know that our next event with our Head of the Lake chapter will be a project with the St. Louis River Alliance. And we'll be going out, I think, on Park Point, Wisconsin Point, but where they deem we will be helpful to remove invasive species and to help with the piping plover habitat. So Chris Eilers will be joining us, she's the director, and she'll be teaching us also about what the St. Louis River Alliance is doing and what's going on with the river. So that's going to be August 25th, which I think it's a Thursday, at 4:30. So it's going to be one of those where hopefully people that can get there later this day. So, thank you.
All right, we are back in business.
good to go.
Yep, sorry about that.
It's quite all right. All right, thanks. Thank you for coming on a nice day. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is kind of a little bit of a collaboration with Robbie and what she thought would be of interest to you folks. But where this all comes from is I'm really in the last stage of having a book done, University of Minnesota Press, next February next year. What I did was I took, lots of people have asked me about the Linklaters, but I tweaked it a little bit. So this is going to be fun for me. And I want to talk about the Linklaters and traditional environmental knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. When people like to use acronyms for everything, so they start talking about the TEK. But so anyway, the Linklaters, I bumped in just a little bit of how I got started. I bumped into them and learned of them in 1976 as a pretty young man, and never was able to really kind of get too involved in it. And then in the last, well, in the 80s, I did a project where about half of it was related to them, and then the book really has come about in the last 7-8 years. And so it's kind of a long-term project, and so a lot of the good stuff, the good information that I've gotten is just conversations through time rather than some sort of dedicated, I'm grilling people with oral history questions or that kind of thing. So it's a lot of serendipity in putting this together, which it still makes me kind of chuckle about the whole thing. So this is John Linklater on my left, and Tchi-Kis-Wis Linklater on my right. And so just a little bit about, there's a term here that probably you maybe aren't as familiar with. Tchi-Kis-Wis was from Lac La Croix First Nation. And you'll see their birth dates and that's coming up. But anyway, family related to Chief Blackstone. I don't know if you've heard Blackstone's name before. Blackstone is pretty much a hero in that part of the world because he was one of the most resilient leaders towards incursions of Christianity and gold miners. He actually threw gold miners out of a lake called Jackfish Lake because there was no treaty at the time. And the Eastern Canadians got really, really angry at Blackstone and that. Mr. Linklater, John, or what most people call was Jack Linklater, is Métis. And do you folks know what Métis is? Okay, so Métis is a person of mixed descent. And I tried to give you a little sense of, he's Scotch, Cree, and Anishinaabe mixed together. Long-term Hudson, his family, long-term Hudson Bay Company roots. And what's interesting about Métis is we use kind of a pejorative term called half-breeds, and you don't see that very often, but that's what was the term that was used for many, many years. But what happened with the Métis people that's quite interesting is that through years and years of being together, they created their own language, their own flag, their own art, and their own governance. And they fought two wars against the Canadian government, and which didn't go too well for them. But anyway, so John is Métis, and to make it just one more thing about that that's kind of interesting to get your head around something a little bit different. Métis is an Aboriginal group that's recognized in Canada. It's just like Inuit or Eskimo or quote Indians. So Canada actually has 3 Aboriginal groups, while we only have 1. So figure that one out. And I'm talking legally, not just kind of people use the term. So Métis have treaty rights. Métis they can hunt in a lot of places. So they're treated just as in the U.S. an Indian group would be treated as. So there's a little bit of a mind bender about how Canadians look at Indigenous people than Americans, and that continues today. All right, and ground rules here. If you have a question, please ask it as we. Oh, okay. Is it asleep maybe? Okay, so this is just kind of an overview of who they are. Linklater was a pretty renowned game warden in the Erie Winston area. We'll talk more about the scientist guide stuff. And we'll talk a lot more about his role on affecting a whole number of conservationists at the time. Tchi-Kis-Wis was an artisan. Okay, here's your next test. How many people here know what Niddy-Wee-Lan is? Okay, just there's a little bit. So it's a plant-based traditional religion of the Anishinaabe people. So Tchi-Kis-Wis was very plant-wise, and you'll see some of the results of that. And if you happen to go in the border lakes, and particularly Basswood Lake today, at one time there was these families, and they're all scattered around Basswood Lake. So when you go in the B-Dub, that was really an occupied area. And if you go to Lac La Croix, they're going to tell you who. They're going to tell you who lived where, and it's an inhabited landscape. We'll call it wilderness. They're going to call it their homeland kind of thing. So, and just another ironic thing about this whole thing is some of the best photographs about the Linklaters are actually in the UMD archives. I mean, they're all over the place, but some of the best ones that you can find are actually. So I used to haunt the UMD archives a fair bit. So this is when they were born. Her birth date and year is, as is common in that time, is a guess. Linklaters a little bit better, although it took me probably about 5 years to figure it out because there was a lot of stories and myths that. And he died, in Jack Fish Bay on the job as an Indian game warden. Or we should say game warden who happened to be Indian or UT. So a little bit about the family, the Linklater family, the Orkneys, Arcadians. At one point, most of the employees for Hudson Bay Company were very poor, dirt poor Arcadians that the ships would leave London and then they'd head up north and they'd stop in the Orkney Islands and people were so desperate. Even a servant, that is the lower echelon of the Hudson Bay Company, you could get paid 3 times working for HBC as you could as staying in Orkney Islands. So guess what? A lot of them went. So there was a period of time when the Hudson Bay, James Bay in particular, where a lot of the Hudson Bay Company, you would hear Orkney there. I mean, there was enough, and then eventually. They started marrying into with Cree women, which is exactly what happened in the Linklaters case. I've happened to I've been to a moose factory, and a couple of these buildings still exist today, which is kind of. So this is home turf for the story. It's kind of an epic geographic story, and then for the Linklaters, it starts moose factory in Port Albany, a big post. And then the Albany River goes all the way, and basically the headwaters is right here, Lake St. Joe. There was a big HBC post there. Jack's grandfather died, drowned lifting the gill net there. Lac Sewell. I always like Kenora, used to be named Grand Portage, so I think they should really go back to it. And then they end up in the Red River area, now called Winnipeg. And then Jack's father started working with the HBC, and he ended up working at a post right in the middle of the Quetico. I mean, Quetico has a history before it became a park, and there actually was a Hudson Bay Company post called Pine Portage. And then this was the real hangout. And then I first bumped into them at Isle Royale. So the whole story is kind of an epic geographic story. And in the book, I like to talk about things like, if you're from Ely, Lac Sewell, which most Americans haven't heard of, is half the distance away than the Twin Cities is from Ely. I mean, you got to kind of get your head around that we may think we're northerly oriented, but not really. Okay. There was 2 fights between the Métis and the Canadian government, Canadian Confederation at the time. And they just, the Métis just blew away. They were under assault, so they just disappeared. There's a lot of Métis people went to the northwest, into northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, that area. So the Linklaters were kind of odd that they went the other direction. So it's kind of an odd kind of footnote. But this is also an irony. This is Linklater's great uncle was one of the first Aboriginal artists in this part of the world. And this is one of his paintings. So and self-taught, and classic and Aboriginal style Cree women wore a certain kind of hood, which is just that Anishinaabe people didn't wear. So there's a whole number of markers here that would tell you that we're in Cree country. And this is Pine Portage. We went up there on a canoe trip not too long ago. That's our canoe. And this is the remains of a steam engine that's in the water. Okay, now I'm going to give you guys, this is the test of all tests for Americans. How many people know about and you're scoring 100% so far. So who here knows about the Dawson Trail? If you go up to Thunder Bay, you'll notice there's a lot of Dawson roads. But what that was about, so the first Métis fight's going on in 1870, right? And Canada has a problem. They just became a confederation, and they got these Métis trying to hold on and say, we want to self-govern. And the Eastern Canadians weren't having that. They were looking out. They knew the prairie provinces were there. They wanted the land. They wanted the farmland. So, and the Americans we were quite aware of this too. So what did the US folks do? They said, okay, if you send a military contingent out there to suppress the Métis, you don't get a free pass through the US. You can't go on US railroads. So the Canadians had to literally hack a road. They could get their people, their military, to Thunder Bay, but then they had to get from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg. And they hacked what's called the Dawson Trail, Dawson Road, Dawson Trail. It's sort of the Canadian equivalent to the Oregon Trail in a way. So, and what they had at these, so there's all these lakes, right? Lakes and rivers, and they had steam engines at one end of the lake, and then they would haul people across to the other end. They dammed things up to raise the water level so the boats could go further. They did all these things right through the middle of the Quetico. So there's think of an Oregon Trail right through the middle of the Quetico.
Question.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How many miles was that
Oh,
from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg?
I used to actually know the answer to that. I'm going to say something. It's not a straight line because they're following, and it basically goes, to approximate the geography, it goes to the northeastern part of the Quetico, goes all the way down to the southwestern, comes out at Lac LaCroix, follows the border route, and then Lake of the Woods pops up and goes towards Winnipeg. It's 790 some miles or something like that. It was only in existence for like 10 years, and then the Canadian railroads came. So it was quite a.
Someone requested the caption, so.
Oh,
Online
okay.
Zoom, so.
I thought that might be a question. So if you go up in the Quetico, you can still find these things like this steam engine, which is pretty cool. And it's just sitting there. Pine Portage, this used to be this. And it was one gigantic, enormous potato field. And now it looks like that. And if you go in the soil, you realize you could grow potato there, unlike most places. Okay, just a little bit more taste about the Linklaters here. So this is the oldest Linklater daughter and the first cousin. If you know, any of you know about the Powell family that lived on Sag, and this would be a first cousin. So these are all Border Lake people. That was their homeland, was right along essentially the international border. Clara made everything you're seeing here. Including, you know, that, I assume it's beaver, coat rather than raccoon, or anything like that, but yes, she was, pretty remarkable seamstress. If some of you, used to read the Duluth newspaper, there used to be an article written pretty frequently by a guy named Warner Warta, about Spirit, often about Spirit Mountain, and Warner would be her grandson. No, Warner would be, yeah. Okay, I've sort of talked about this a little bit. That's where you basically out of mixing of cultures. There's actually a technical term for that called ethnogenesis. This is, we're in, the Canadian side, we're an Anglican country, and it's still, there's still traveling Anglican ministers that go up and down. This church sometimes gets used. It's restored. It's on Lake St. Joseph. Anybody been to Lake St. Joseph or know where it is? You gotta go pretty far north to get there. There's a whole bunch of Linklater descendants buried there. Two daughters, and I'm not. I don't think this is the grave house of Maggie Linklater. It very well could be, but I'm not convinced of this. Well, one of the reasons the Linklaters stayed on Basswood Lake and Jackfish Bay, because there was a time when basically getting souvenirs from grave houses was what non-Indigenous people did. And this is actually a friend of the family who's visiting at some grave houses. This young woman died tragically. She was abandoned by her husband and died after giving birth. Pretty sad story. And that time, that whole episode wasn't even covered in the Ely or Virginia newspaper. Just a young Indian woman dying just didn't even make the news. Okay, so to get on to a little bit, to tweak this a little bit, so just some introductory ideas about traditional archaeological knowledge. And it's usually knowledge by Indigenous people, and it could be South America, it could be Borneo, it could be anywhere, Australia. There's been a lot of work with Inuit in Alaska, traditional archaeological knowledge related particularly to whaling, which is kind of interesting. But this is kind of a generalized definition of it. So it's not just, and I think you can read it yourself, but the important part is it's something you practice. It's not a body of knowledge like you would find information in a book. It contains that kind of information, but you actually, in a day-to-day basis, you put it into effect. So, you know, if that's weather knowledge, if that's fish behavior knowledge, if that's Linklater and Choza, two game wardens, they were one of the first to realize moose were behaving strangely, and moose were starting, this is in the early 1920s, moose were starting to go circle to the right always. And what they were describing was there's the first advent talking about brainworm. It had hit them at the time. So they had already noticed the symptoms. They, of course, couldn't say what was going on. But oftentimes there's a really time depth of knowledge or, you know, strongly situated in nature. You can find traditional ecological knowledge in stories and legends, not just in knowledge. Linklater's uncle was recorded telling the number of Cree trickster stories. And within those Cree trickster stories, there's a lot of information about moose and what moose did on the Canadian prairies. and what they did when they were disturbed. So you can find traditional ecological knowledge conversing with somebody, watching somebody, or even in what it is that they, that they consider our important stories. Okay. Yeah. Any questions there? There's some pretty substantive ideas there. Everybody got that digested? Yeah, Robbie?
Can you repeat how to pronounce her name? Tchi-Kis-Wis?
Tchi-Kis-Wis.
Tchi-Kis-Wis.
Yeah.
I know this has been done with other people who had this ecological knowledge, but was there somebody that spent time with her and wrote some of that down, or was that kind of all
No.
lost?
The short answer is no, because they were gone 50 years before anybody even thought TK in the way we think of it today even existed. So you can find hints of it, and you can find suggestions of it, but also what was also happening, there's a lot of cultural things that in play. Indian women at that time, traditional Indian women, if they many of them thought it was better off not to speak, and particularly not to speak English. So there's a whole group of kind of cohorts of hers that they wouldn't speak English. They knew it, but it was just safer just to, because somebody's going to want something, somebody's going to take something, somebody's going to get the Indian agent to do this. So it's just better off to act like you can't speak. Pretty sad. And this is one of the things that got me going on the whole thing, and I bumped into a very early reference to Jack Linklater's grandfather and Tchi-Kis-Wis's grandmother came to Isle Royale. Well, I don't know if you guys have been to Isle Royale, but paddling there by canoe, it is a serious bit of business, a very serious bit of business. And so this just stuck with me. It like 40 years it took me to answer one half of this question. This is Jack Linklater's grandfather, who turns out to be a great uncle. But in indigenous communities, if somebody's important to you, you will speak to him as a grandfather. I mean, he is a blood relative, but he's a great uncle. And he was the last Hudson Bay Company clerk in Fort William or Thunder Bay. So he saw basically Tchi-Kis-Wis and her grandmother paddle across to Isle Royale. That takes TK and courage. And here's another so Robbie, here's another kind of indirect thing of TK. So if you guys know the Tripp family, William Tripp, he did some remarkable mapping. And one of the things he spent a lot of time with the Native Americans, and Erie would be down here. And what this is like pre-GIS. I get so excited when I see this, but you see the pink, that's wild rice beds. So somebody's telling Trig, and he's recording where to go for wild rice. Turns out Basswood was an unbelievable wild rice lake. And that's one of the reasons people were there. And it was part of the time where you don't see this anymore. It's a tradition that's lost, but Anishinaabeg people would come and they would pull the stalks up and then tie them together like a bundle sheaf. And they'd let the rice finish off. It was one way to keep the rice from blowing into the water if you had a strong wind. But there's actually some really interesting diagrams of like at this time, like 1900 more or less, where there were signs left from one family that would basically leave a sign, a sheaf of wild rice pointing in this direction. And let's just say it was pointing this way because the rice is really good. So that was their way of telling each other, which is, it works. This little lake becomes kind of important. This is where Sigurd Olson and Jack Linklater spent some time in Hula Lake together. So just some testimonials here. Linklater was two things. He was an extraordinary woods person and his reputation was unbelievable. So when he became a game warden, there were some rules that were played in the area, and that is Linklater was happy to let you harvest the deer out of season if your family was hungry. But if you went into town and you talked about it, you were caught. The next time you went out, you were caught. So there's a whole subset of what I call almost Linklater game warden rules. And this is during the Depression, you know, so and he said one thing was kind of interesting. He said, I like hunting men. It's more interesting than hunting animals. The other thing that the other deterrence he would do is he would often watch people and he could do that quite well. And so then maybe in a grocery store or a hardware store a week later and Jack would wander up, and you got to understand he's indigenous, right? And so he's doing this to a white man. And he would say, hey, you know, I was out at this lake, you know, or he'd name the lake, and you know, I was out at Gunflint Lake and the other day, and it was like 12 o'clock, and I saw this guy, and he had 6 lines in the water, and he hauled a bunch of fish in, and this, of course, he's talking to the guy who did that. So that was his other way of basically telling him, I know you were there, I know you were doing it, but in this case, the Linklater rule was if your family is hungry, he knew what hunger was. That was okay. I don't think the Game and Fish Department would probably appreciate that, but one of the things Linklater got involved in was moose studies. And this is actually Jack, and that's actually a guy named Frank Warren. And one of the things they would do, and they did this to about 600 moose on Isle Royale, is basically they would, I don't even know what the term is, but they would chase a moose to try to gauge its health, because there was an argument going on about whether these moose were healthy or not. So the best thing they could figure out was, hey, we'll give them a chase in the water and we'll keep track of X and see what can turn up. And then they started doing things like documenting what the submerged underwater plants. He had a very curious, he was always thinking. So he was always trying to figure out what was going on. And this is kind of a regular kind of thing. So he's out with Alice Warren, and they find the last caribou antlers on Isle Royale. There used to be woodland caribou. And all this is kind of interesting, but Alice Warren, for some of you, this will be interesting, was the first woman regent of the University of Minnesota system, and was a buddy of Jack Linklater's. Folks were just, he had quite a memory too. So, I mean, he could tell you bird behavior, he could tell you, and he could remember the dates. This is only half of the quote. But so what happened, and I don't have a slide on this, but I do, well, I do talk about it in the book. I'm going to go back. Linklater ended up, by my count, ended up in helping 16 university scientists, University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, University of Illinois, and some Washington, D.C. folks. He was helping people in parasitology, in zoology, fisheries, botany, archaeology, and geology. Wow. So, I mean, basically, if you were a university scientist in, say, 1930, and you wanted to do work in this part of the world, you wanted to find Linklater. And indeed, you're going to see, I'm going to steal my thunder, but it's coming up. One of the most amazing thing I saw in this whole thing was a letter from Sigurd Olson writing to Aldo Leopold saying, if you need a guide, get Jack Linklater. I mean, if that doesn't take you kind of to the cream of the crop, at least at that This is a really complicated picture, and I don't know how much time we want to spend on it, but these two guys, are kind of messing with Indian stereotypes, and they know they're being watched at the time, so they're fooling around like eating fish with your fingers, you know. They're out with a bunch of VIPs, the mayor of Minneapolis, and a whole bunch of hotshots, and so they're fooling with these people's minds right now, you know, and enjoying it. So Linklater did, if you remember the dates roughly, they lived before all the big cutting happened. So they lived through all of the cutting of the BW, and indeed he worked in some of the most dangerous jobs, logging at the time. He's apparently up here on the hoist, or so people say. Did a whole bunch of things, guiding women. They were school teachers. They're trying to prove that women could get in the boundary waters. And there's one epic story, I think it's about half true, but after Tchi-Kis-Wis gave birth, if you know the geography, Poplar Lake, you know where Poplar Lake is at the Gunflint. The story goes that he carried her from there to Grand Marais. I don't believe totally all that, but she had had an abscess after giving birth, and there was no way out. So, but then when she got to Grand Marais, she wouldn't let the white doctor touch her. So anyway. This is Linklater. He's about 62 years old for some of us folks, to give you an idea. It's a sea stack in Isle Royale. And this is his best friend, I guess, and best white friend and boss, Bill Hansen. This is a really interesting picture because Jack and Tchi-Kis-Wis are some of the first to bring parkas into the area. And so I've spent a fair bit of time trying to figure out, there were some claims made that they introduced parkas. And of course, Jack has a lot of Cree blood and Cree family, and that is parka country. And it's looking at this point, I can't find any evidence to refute this, that this wasn't the first introduction. So I keep teasing, if you know who Paul Shirky is and Wintergreen, you should do a Linklater outdoor line, you know, you should get on with it, you know, you're behind the time. He just looks at me and shakes his head. So they took these VIPs at 3 different trips across the boundary waters. Jack was at that time, the state had regulatory authority in the boundary waters. So state game wardens did all the work there, but the state had their own dog teams at that time. And that was kind of Jack's bailiwick. In addition to, he had a family dog team. So that's what a lot of people think was basically one of his greatest attributes was as a musher. And here's just another one of the crossing. And these are all wealthy Twin Cities folks. Well, there is something that changes here though. So on the 3rd trip, I believe, they're up at doesn't matter where they were. And the northern game wardens were getting kind of perturbed with the wealthy individuals from the cities that seemed to think that they knew what they were doing and would brag about it. And this got under Jack's nerve a little bit. So they did a whole thing of a fake lynx attack on 3 different nights. And they had, the game wardens had the mayor of Minneapolis and others going to bed with the guns, and they started asking the cooks for knives underneath the, Jack made a little sled, and then he got a big can, and then there's a cameraman involved. He got some red the transparent paper that you put on cut 2 holes like for eyes, put a candle in it and dragged it across the ice one night. And they all jumped up and they were shooting away, but then the next night there was the howling. And Jack jumped up and just started speaking Anishinaabe, and they're and then they dragged this lynx across, and then there was the kaboom, 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 shooting it. It's pretty good. I mean, out of poster board, that's pretty good to do that, probably in a short period of time. But then the next morning they felt guilty about it, so they finally told the VIPs what went on, and some of them still didn't believe it. I don't know if you can read this, but he met a Potawatomi man on Isle Royale. And then he replied in Anishinaabe, Moen. I thought that was pretty cool. Jack could speak English, French, Anishinaabe, Cree, and then Métis language called Bungi. So, and he could read, and he only had 2 years of schooling. So, I mean, how many of us can speak 5 languages? I can't even do English credit, but, and this one I just love because this is pre-OSHA. It's just, I think it's great, you know, they just saw the nest and then they start cobbling things together. So there's a famous quip. Jack actually appears in most, every one but one of Sigurd Olson's book. And this is probably one of the more important ones, but Sigurd Olson was pretty taken by Linklater, and Linklater had a pretty big influence on, you know, I don't know how much Sigurd Olson stuff you've read, but he was sort of a seeker of religious meaning in nature. And Linklater literally blew his mind because Linklater was always bringing up Anishinaabe beliefs. And not that Sigurd Olson actually believed that, but here they are camping together. Documented they were out at least 6 times, I suspect more than that. But, you know, so you're out with this guy, he's a little taller than I am, but he's, you know, he just can get along in the woods, he can live off the woods. And then he starts telling you these essentially legends. And Sigurd Olson had just kind of, and this is about the time where he starts reading philosophy. So, and I don't know if you know the biographer David Backus, but he thinks that Linklater had a pretty strong impact on Sigurd Olson, on his philosophy. This is that Aldo Leopold, Sigurd Olson. Do anything you can, everything in your power. I just think that's cool. So one of the things about TEK that makes it particularly useful for scientific endeavors is generally, if it's fairly intact, it usually has a very long-term interest. So they're looking through patterns through a long period of time. So oftentimes they're the first folks to see big changes because they've been seeing things through time. And I think that's one of the things where TEK is probably going to be most useful. It just takes a, you know, it's not a 3-year study or a 5-year study. It's, you know, you've got accumulation of generations thinking about, you know, what's happening with a particular plant. Why is it disappearing? Why are woodland caribou migrating out of the boundary waters? Why are moose getting sick in Minnesota, but they're holding on Isle Royale? That was a real conundrum in the 20s and the 30s. You know, the Michiganders they got moose everywhere. They think they got too many moose. And then suddenly we have the start of brainworm on our side of things. That's the kind of thing you struggle with whatever kinds of information they would bring to mind. this is what started, this is the first slide I saw of Linklater. I said, who is this guy? And what had happened was he guided a private archaeological, and they gave him, this is kind of paternalistically, but they gave him a top hat and $100 bill. And then they turn it around. This is Tchi-Kis-Wis when she's older and her dad, and they're just screwing around for the camera. He couldn't play a mandolin, but he's just fooling around. So one of the things about Linklater that is pretty stunning is quite a reputation in his day. When he died, virtually every newspaper, almost every state in the United States carried an article about that. And for an Indian to die in 1933, and the Minneapolis Tribune did a full page on it. I mean, he was not a forgotten soul at the time. He was pretty well understood. It's really appreciated, if misunderstood. The fatalistic thing that they talk about there is not true at all. And one of the things is an indication of Sig Olson's affection for Linklater is after Linklater died, he proposed the Isaac Walton Lake chapter in Ely be named after Linklater, which was a pretty interesting thing to do. There are some movies of Linklater doing stuff, and this one also tickles me. He's repairing the canoe, the Hula Lake. Maybe you've read about this, but where you melt spruce gum into cracks or tears, and that's what he's doing. And this is caught on film in the 20s. Isle Royale has this. Got to be really careful though, otherwise if your birch torch doesn't do what you want it to do, you don't have a canoe. They end up in National Geo. Tchi-Kis-Wis doesn't look really happy about it, but nonetheless, and that's their place on Isle Royale. I'm going to give you just a little bit of sense of who she's about. This has been really interesting to me, and I don't know if it's true, but a couple of native people have said to me that that's a Midi-Weewian hat. And it very well could be true, I just don't know. But that someone would have a signifier like that is quite interesting to me, that she would be a practitioner. This is a photograph of there are no photographs of their place. And this is on Basswood on Jackfish Bay. That's just one of them where you get part of it. She sewed everything that he wore, that wool coat she sewed. She's just making everything, which is pretty amazing to me, including these babies.
Wow.
So every once in a while you get kind of lucky, and Tchi-Kis-Wis has made a whole bunch of cedar mats in the 1920s and early 30s. They're made from the inner bark of cedar, and then they're dyed, and it's really sort of like it's an Anishinaabe craft that was pretty much lost. There's actually some revival going on now, but there's a dozen of hers still in existence, which is the largest collection in the world, which happens to be a Grand Portage National Monument. And every one of them is different. This one, I believe, is, if I remember which one it is about 6.5 feet by 8 feet something. So they're pretty big. They're called Ojibwa linoleum because they were used as quote rugs or carpet. And if you're moving all the time, it'd be great to have something that you could roll up and then take with you. And then they're so beautiful. What started to happen is whites started buying them from women who would make them, and a whole number of them survived on Isle Royale. They're just spectacular. So that's not even a very good photograph. Here's another one. That's a green in that. some of them have fallen apart and are edges, and you could tell. I've had to get pretty wonkish about this, so I won't look at, but she's starting up here, she's moving left to right. And then when you get done with the whole thing, you have a seam that goes all the way around and then it comes up and ties it together. What was interesting is most of these were made on Isle Royale and they were at a fishery. So what happens at a fishery? You have all this extra line, all this extra twine, you know, from putting on corks or so these, if you guys, you can really tell Tchi-Kis-Wis cedar mat because they on the edging is all made out of fishing. It's a cotton line that, you know, used to be used on the shore here by the fishermen that, you know, we all know about. Here's one being made in Ely. The other part that's really cool about this is we sit in sort of the capital of Anishinaabeg cedar mat making. I mean, the Border Lake country was the biggest production area. So, you know, you sort of think of kind of what kind of indigenous craft it really is, gets highlighted. This is it. This is it. And when you go, the Smithsonian only has a few, the Canadian museums only have a few, and yet there's a dozen of Tchi-Kis-Wis, the ones that survive, and there's almost a dozen in Grand Portage that survive. So it's really the epicenter of cedar mat making. These are just other things, yeah.
Has anybody taken up the art, the craft?
Yes, kind of. There's some starts of it. There's a gentleman from Lac du Flambeau that's taught a couple classes at North House in Grand Marais, also on the res. And then there was just an article in a newspaper, I don't know if it was a Duluth paper, about a mat that was made in Leech Lake. But pretty much from about the 1920s until just a few years ago, it was an art form that was pretty much gone. So like this guy from Lac du Flambeau, he goes to the Grand Portage because he has to, you know, he looks at them and then he learns. What's really changed though is Tchi-Kis-Wis is using all native dyes. And most people now are using, of course, synthetic dyes. But it's hard to know what's going to happen because I think there's a market for them. You know, if I saw one, I would probably spring a fair bit of money for it. So, you know, it's a question, is there a high-end market for something like that? You know, it's one thing to buy beaded earrings kind of thing, but would you be willing to pay a fair bit of money for, you know, one of those?
I just learned how to do it.
I learned how to do it, yeah.
Is it sustainable? I mean, cedars don't go that fast.
Right, and there's two ways of doing it. There's a way where you chop the tree down and you strip it, and then there's you know what? I'm going to do another anthro term on you. Do you know what a CMT is? You guys should know this here. Culturally modified tree. So if you go on Grand Portage Trail, there's only a couple left, but basically they're cedars, and where someone has the tree goes up and they chopped, you know, unfortunately people are taller than I am, but they chop here and then they strip down, or they vice versa, and they strip up. And you can see this if you're in the boundary waters or something, you'll bump into these occasionally.
But I don't know why people do this also.
Yeah, and when I worked in Alaska, they not only did that, but they ate some of the tree bark, which was a whole new thing for me to learn about that. The Haida Tlingit have a really wonderful tradition, but they're weaving in wool. So they're weaving in cedar bark with wool for chilkoot blankets, and those puppies are, you know, 10 grand, 20 grand, 30 grand. There was a WCCO radio personality, Dara Aldridge, and Jack would get all these kinds of things where the state fair or, you know, the game and fish department would send him to the cities for things. And here he is taking the radio personality out for a spin. She wrote a book called Earth Never Tires, which is a fictional account of the Linklaters, among other things. And the Linklater has made this the strangest canoe I've ever seen. So this is Jack and then Alice Warren, the first woman regent. And this is the canoe that Tchi-Kis-Wis made. But you start to see some odd things here. Are you guys seeing this? Somebody just said it. It's the birch bark canoe, and then they put canvas on the outside. I mean, they're literally blending technology. They're fooling around with technology that is, in this case, probably not a good idea because the canvas will hold the moisture in. But nonetheless, this canoe still exists and it's 110 years old. So, but anyway, that's them and then what it looks like today. And I talked about the parkas. There's just two examples of them. Linklaters were traditional Anishinaabe belief is, is gift giving. So most of these parkas were given away, and the state. This is a game warden. They basically Tchi-Kis-Wis kind of outfitted the state game wardens that are in that part of the world. And here's 4 generations. Tchi-Kis-Wis, her dad, and then her grandson. And I don't know who the dude is on the far side.
Rich guy.
Probably. This is, if you know Isle Royale, one of the things I've not been able to explain, but do you know, anybody know where McCargo Cove is? Okay, McCargo Cove is very close to the largest copper deposits on Isle Royale. And copper is a very important, powerful entity in Anishinaabe belief. And so the Linklaters end up with their friends, end up buying a fishery that's only about a half-mile away from the Monong mines, where native copper is still there. So I think there's something going on there, but this is the kind of stuff, because it is important and it's sacred. Robbie, it's another case where it just doesn't, what's really happening is beyond what people recorded. So just a little bit more about TK. This is really important, and this is probably what would appeal to some of the naturalists. I love this photograph. What's the dog doing in the That's new dog discipline. I don't know what's going on there. So, any thoughts, questions, comments? Okay.
I know that the Forest Service is starting to use a little more TK, if you will, about burning. Is that happening across the area, or?
You mean in our neck of the woods? I think there's starts of that, and there's some examples where TK is being used. But it's, I mean, there are places where it's really being strongly, the Australian park system or the indigenous people is really, the International Whaling Commission up in Alaska really has TK really built into the, so there's places that are miles and other places on that.
Jim, someone on Zoom would like to know what's the name of the upcoming book and when will it be out?
Okay, the book is called Making the Carry, The Lives of John and Tchi-Kis-Wis Linklater. And University of Minnesota Press tells me it'll be available in February of 2023.
Are you working on anything else?
I am. And I'm writing about sort of forgotten events and then individuals on Isle Royale. Usually pretty colorful folks. And I often, if you've read some of my stuff, I get accused of being too serious, too footnotey. I like that term, too footnotey. So I decided I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to be off the cuff and I'm going to just let her rip. So it's been fun to write.
So if you spend, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sherry. Do you spend a lot of time on Isle Royale?
I used to. I go back every once in a while. I probably am going back in August, but no, I'm one of those increasing group of people that thinks about it more than goes there. So
I was wondering if he ever met Oberholzer or vice versa. It seems like they had parallel interests, his lifelong interest in the Ojibwe culture and people. He spent a lot of time, and he also mapped for the first time huge, number of miles of the Boundary Waters lakes, and so there's a lot of parallels, and I just wondered if they ever connected in their time.
I don't believe so, although there was a near miss. Oberholzer, about the time that there was the US Congress was looking at what they should do with the boundary waters, was about the same time they were looking at whether Isle Royale should become a national park or not. So Oberholzer labored very hard to get a committee of congressional kind of a VIP delegation to come to both places. And the first place they were going to stop was at Jack Linklater's place in McCardle Cove. But the whole trip went south, so, yeah. I can't think of Oberholzer's guide's name right.
Billy McGee.
Billy McGee originally is a Grand Portager. And then ended up in, Same Lake area. So the way this works in Anishinaabe world, Billy McGee and Tchi-Kis-Wis would be speaking the same dialect. There's something called the Border Lake dialect, and that's what Billy McGee spoke, and Jack and Tchi-Kis-Wis would too. There was really 5 dialectical regions of Anishinaabe land. So when you get down to kind of the specifics of it, and I'm not a linguistic person, but you can tell where people are from by the dialect that they're using. And that's one of the first things that's being lost in languages lost is dialect. That goes before the actual overall language goes. There's no Anishinaabe speakers in Mille Lacs. There's 3 in Grand Portage. And some of the other reses have, 20 and 60, but it's going.
Have you bumped into any descendants? of
Yeah.
them?
Yes, and there's 2 descendants in Duluth that some of you might know. There's a professor in the med school who would be Warner Huerta's, well, he is Warner Huerta's daughter. So she's a professor in UMD. And then Christine Woods, who runs Christine? Runs the Art Institute, Duluth Art Institute. They are both great granddaughters.
We had another Zoom question. Is the Grand Portage Museum the best place to see artifacts for the Linklaters?
It's really the only place to see them, so yes. What we need to do is get, most of the mats are available. Right now, they're still in storage. So I think there's 2 on exhibit, but what really needs to be done is to put together a full scale exhibit around the mats. Yeah.
Yeah, the question on the use of TEK. I spent some time looking at the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is a binational treaty with Canada. And there are Metis and First Nation and Native American representatives on there. And when it was time for them to speak to whatever the issues were, the information is not very actionable in our legalistic kind of view of the world. It tended to be kind of not specific and very long-term broad, and those are not the things that our system is very adept at dealing with. So any thoughts on, is there hope for any meshing of the philosophies, if you will?
I don't know about meshing, but some people are certainly doing a better job of it. And, you know, there's a whole number of things that I think are kind of would help that happen. One is to develop the kind of rapport with someone who really is a strong TEK person. It takes a long time. And it's not something that's going to be, speaking of actionable is a good term. You know, you just can't knock on somebody's door and say, because that's not what happens culturally, and say, can you say this or that? They may or may not know something that's helpful to you, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to tell you either. I had a remarkable kind of experience the opposite way. So, you know, maybe there's some hope on things like this, but maybe some of you here long-term Duluthians would have known about the Severson fishery. And I got to be, I guess, how would I say this? I was a download for Stanley Severson on a lot of fishery related things. And Stanley is a good example of a TEK person. He wouldn't know, he would call it that. But I would interview him about fishing, particularly families and stuff on Isle Royale. And where I failed, Joe, and this was kind of interesting to me, because Stanley just knew stuff. I mean, he knew that. And when you talk to him, and you'd say, because he, you know, fishing, commercial fishing, you got to know about currents, got to know where fish are going up and down, and you know what species is where, and currents change. And when I started asking Stanley about currents, in particular, what happened was I would get a generic response. But the way this guy's brain works, and he would be a lot like Linklater, I had to give him enough data where it was a real question. I mean, he was sort of like, he was being kind to me, but in a way. But you'd say, well, and then it took me a few years to figure this out because I'm not the sharpest bulb in the world. But finally, you'd say, okay, Stanley, it's July 4th, it's been hot, it hasn't rained in a while. The barometer is this, and the wind is offshore coming this direction. He goes, oh yeah, you'd probably be at 85 feet, and you got to be down here because they're going to be running this direction. And that's when I realized, holy man, he's got that in his head. I just was not able to get him. But even how would you use that? That's so specific. It's the opposite thing. It's so specific. How would you use that in any kind of?
Well, that actually makes me think that TEK is not the domain of necessarily one culture or another.
No.
It's in our own culture, and we just don't always recognize it.
Right. The key is when we talk about it, or I talked about it being often in an indigenous world, because oftentimes they've had a very long-term and integral part of nature. But then Stanley was, he lived and breathed and thought fish just all the time. And so, anybody, you're right, anybody, it's not exclusive day, it's not a racial thing at all. Yeah, but elders are good for it. Right. If we can remember things.
Well, and how much of that TEK philosophy is dovetailed with the simple term of ecology, which has been lost in a lot of schools of thought with agencies and governments and things. I mean, they don't think about ecology as much as commodity or products, and even the word resource, which I try not to use when I'm talking about the natural world.
Yeah.
They're not natural
Yeah.
resources, but
Yeah.
that's what we look at them as. And that's how even a place like Boulder Lake is able to function, because it's multi-use,
Right,
right? And so then you're able to help show people that important interaction between humans and the natural environment, and the natural environment with itself, with the climate, with the things that are done to and with it by people and animals. That's ecology, and that's TEK,
Right.
right?
yeah, right. Yeah, no, language is important, and, you know, whether you put people off by your language or, you know, resources, there's well, I mean, just the language that gets sometimes used, it just sets people off in the wrong direction. And when you think about it, resources is really kind of it's a kind of a word that separates things. Resources versus what? And a lot of TEK people, that would be pretty much foreign to them, where there's not that separation.
If anybody reads High Country News, they had an issue that was about the legal system, and there was a firm that was advocating for various nations, whatever, that really advised, you know, most of the virtue is in having the discussion before you even start talking about a decision. Because you don't grasp the background and the way people think until much, much later. And I don't think there's too many attorneys who want to do that.
Well, it depends if they're paid by the hour, it takes long.
Well,
Well, I mean, my experience at Grand Portage and with Alaska Natives, I mean, I always say that they have a PhD in bullshit. I mean, they can detect whether somebody's trying to extract something just for the sake of, you know, themselves, or, and if there isn't some sort of collaboration and some sort of sense of, you know, and I'm being pretty crude here, you know, what's in it for me, but, you know, if I come up and I ask Olson in Grand Portage, who is truly a remarkable tradition barrier, you know, Ellen, tell me about X, and she starts saying, and starts telling me, the rules are I need to be quiet. And whatever she finds important to tell me is what we learn, not what I want to learn at that particular moment. Which this was long ago, but, you know, she was the one who first told me about the use of Tchi-Kis-Wis as fatty lake trout that would be rendered, and that was used as lotion. And, you know, lotion, I do this because she was always talking about her feet and putting, and then it was used as a way of, what do you call it? You would put medicine in it, so it was a way that you would ingest the medicines. Yeah. But she took me there. If I said, Ellen, we're talking about Tchi-Kis-Wis, you know, we'd go somewhere else. So, you know.
depends on how you ask the question, you have to give her enough information in the question, like you were saying before.
Yeah. But then, I mean, magic happens. So her foster grandfather was born in a canoe paddling back from Isle Royale, and they just about made landfall when Posey was born in a canoe. And then being Portage, then what do is she come up with a nickname, it was known as Stump. Because they were there, almost made it to where the tree line. Anything else? It's a beautiful day outside.
Well, just curious of the path that brought you to working on these books. How did you start? How did your interest start with all this?
Well, I mean, how did it start? Couple things. One is the subject is just compelling. I'm not a great writer. This will be book 5. But I don't consider myself really a particularly good writer. I like to write. But it's the subject that carries me over the finishing line. So that's really more, academia almost killed my writing because I couldn't understand a plot line after I got through. And that's what people like. If people like a story, if you write history, I mean, that's the root of what it means is to tell a story. So I really had to almost relearn the craft as I got out after being an academic. It's really the subjects. They just, and the Linklater thing was a peculiar one because, for me, because it's so epic of a story. I mean, I haven't told you about grandma who was accused of infant infanticide. I haven't told you about, Uncle Charlie ending up in the Metis Wars. I mean, this story is everything. I mean,
In the book, though, right?
it's in the book, yeah.
Okay, so we got
But then there's a different obligation as a writer. Oh man, I hope I don't screw up. I hope I don't screw up. I hope this is so good that don't screw up. So then you feel like, that becomes kind of a. Yeah.
Where were you located in Alaska, and did you have any experience with natives there?
I was located in Anchorage, and my job was I was the regional anthropologist for the National Park Service. So I traveled a lot. I've probably been more Alaska Native villages than most people. And really what my job was dispute resolution between parks and Alaska natives. So I spent a lot of time, which I didn't know anything about at the time, but I got a little Glacier Bay, Katmai, Berry Land Bridge, Yukon Charlie. Yukon Charlie was sad. Usually it was the Park Service that was screwing up. But yeah, it was Sitka. So I've been to all the Alaska parks, even Aniak Jet, which is pretty hard to get to, but I was not based in a park.
Much interaction with the Tlingit?
Yeah,
So-
it's both Sitka and Glacier Bay. Glacier Bay it's a really sad one. Huna is the closest traditional community, and they, when Anilka came in, Jim Carter, there was all the subsistence stuff that happened, but the older parks don't have those possibilities for natives to hunt or fish in parks. Glacier Bay is a terrible one because there are two Huna clans that believe they came, not only lived there, but actually came out of the ground in Glacier Bay. And it was illegal for them to commercial fish, harvest seagull eggs, a whole bunch of them. So yeah, I got involved in that. That one was pretty hot. There was almost some violence involved in that one.
So do you have a book on that?
No, I don't. I got into trouble too with the Park Service because it sounds so crazy. Like now in Glacier Bay, we did a memorandum of understanding, which just is a kind of let's be happy and work together document. Park Service didn't like that. Got into trouble for that. Got into trouble for, so this is the great one. So Katmai, has anybody been to Katmai? It's a cool place, but anyway, so this is what you need to know if you ever see the pictures of, and do you watch the bear cam? Does anybody watch the bear cam?
Yeah.
That's Brooks Camp, that's Katmai. So, here's what you need to know. I'm gonna spoil the bear cam for you, but, Brooks Camp is this big salmon run, and then there's all these bears. Brooks Camp was the second longest inhabited native community in North America. And guess who ran them off? The Park Service. And so there was some native allotments right where those fat bears are, because the natives wouldn't, the bears were dead if they were there. there was some fish, because, we couldn't live them. But, so I took a contingent of, the Anguson family that had the allotment. And they were in the middle of a lawsuit with the Park Service, and there's Cochran out there with, Alaska Natives at the same time that they're suing each other, so you can see how I can get into trouble pretty easily. But the other thing about Katmai is really no sad thing, there's burials everywhere. So what do you have when you have a long-term Native community? You have burials, so everybody's walking on burials. And no one's really telling you that either. No, it's kind of a sad one, because the bears are so amazing. That's not TEK, that was just bad politics.
I think we could use you between the Republicans and the Democrats.
No, wouldn't survive that.
No,
Wouldn't survive that.
I have a kind of a meta question, whatever. TPK is sort of like time and place, I think. There's lots of traditional knowledge, it really still is very valuable,
Right,
but we're changing the environment.
right.
How much of that is going away because of what we changed?
So that's certainly true, but don't think of TDK as a set bit of knowledge that's kind of frozen in time. It's always asking those questions, so ticks show up in Cook County, what's going on? That's the obvious one, is climate change. Although the indicators of when it was happening, I'm not sure people have paid, and there's, turkeys now in Cook County. Those are easy ones, right? But no, it's always if it's still vibrant, it's still asking those questions. And it's asking questions about change. It may not have any quote answers, but it's very alert to that. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Folks want to get on the Master Naturalist email list, I've got a pad over on the table, put your email address